In the dim light of a cramped stone tomb, a young woman named Alexandra huddled in the shadows. For 10 long years she had lived here, sealing herself off from the world. Her only companions were the whispers of the wind and the persistent silence of the tomb. Why had she chosen this lonely, harsh existence? Because a man's mind had been clouded by desire for her, and she had taken it upon herself to protect his soul. She believed that by walling herself away, she could save him from sin and damnation. This act of self-sacrifice was not unique. It was part of a long tradition where women were expected to bear the burden of men's desires, often to the point of extreme self-denial. In the early Middle Ages, the ideals of holiness and chastity were deeply intertwined, but the expectations placed on women and men were far from equal. Women like Alexandra were celebrated for their acts of self-mutilation and seclusion, while men were often praised for their spiritual struggles and asceticism. One such woman was Radegund, a 6th century noblewoman who found herself married to the powerful Frankish King Clothar. Despite her high status, Radegund yearned for a life of piety and chastity. She often left her husband's bed at night to pray in the cold, wearing a hair shirt and kneeling on the hard ground. Her biographers, Venantius Fortunatus and the nun Botnivia, emphasized her rejection of worldly trappings and her dedication to a life of prayer and service to God. Eventually, Radegund fled her royal life to become a nun, but her story was less about sexual purity and more about her rejection of the world's temptations. Another example is Balthold, a 7th century Anglo-Saxon slave who caught the eye of a high royal official named Urchinold. To escape a forced marriage, she hid under a pile of rags, hoping to avoid a human marriage and instead merit a spiritual union with God. Her story took a different turn when she later married the Merovingian king Clovis II. Despite her initial struggle, Balthold remained active in the church and eventually retired to a monastery, where she spent her final years in devotion. The lives of these holy women were often recorded in hagiographies, or saintly biographies, which followed specific conventions. These stories were not meant to be factual accounts, but rather idealized narratives intended to inspire readers and showcase the virtues of the saints. Through these tales, we see a set of ideals about female sanctity, where chastity played a significant role, even if it was not always the central focus. For early medieval male saints, chastity was often assumed rather than highlighted. Men like Benedict, Amandus, and Boniface were known for their humility, faith, and miraculous deeds, but their chastity was a given. Benedict, for example, faced a moment of temptation in his youth when the image of a woman he had known sparked a desire within him. To combat this, he stripped off his clothes and rolled in thorns, lacerating his body and conquering his sin. This act of self-mortification was meant to show that he could overcome his desires and remain chaste, a virtue that became even more crucial as the Middle Ages progressed. Monks and nuns were expected to maintain a life of chastity, which was seen as a mark of their spiritual superiority. Monastic rules were strict, and monks were warned against any behavior that might lead to sexual temptation. The Byzantine abbot Theodore of Staudios advised his monks to avoid touching or looking at their bodies, as even the thought of sexual desire could be considered a sin. The emphasis on resisting temptation was a key aspect of monastic life, and those who succeeded were considered virtuous and strong. In the Eastern Church, eunuchs played a complex role. While some served as priests and bishops, they were often viewed with suspicion. Their lack of sexual desire was seen as a physical condition rather than a spiritual achievement, and they were sometimes considered dangerous because they could tempt other men. In the Western Church, the idea of self-castration for religious reasons was generally condemned, as it was seen as a one-time act that removed the need for ongoing struggle. Instead, the ideal was to achieve a state of spiritual castration, where one's desires were overcome through constant vigilance and faith. The Reform movement of the 11th century brought significant changes to the Church's stance on clerical celibacy. Previously, while monks were expected to be celibate, the secular clergy, like parish priests, were not. However, as the Church sought to assert its independence and moral authority, it began to enforce strict standards of behavior, including celibacy for all clergy. This change was part of a broader effort to separate the Church from the world, and to present its members as purer and more virtuous than the laity. The new ideal of clerical celibacy required priests to fight manfully against temptation, much like the monks and nuns who had come before them. In this world of strict moral codes and spiritual battles, the lives of holy men and women were shaped by a complex interplay of ideals, expectations, and personal struggles. Their stories, whether told in hagiographies or remembered through the ages, continue to shed light on the medieval understanding of chastity, piety, and the human condition. In the early Middle Ages, the Church placed a strong emphasis on chastity and ritual purity, particularly among the clergy. This focus was not entirely new, as monastic literature had long stressed the importance of chastity for monks and nuns. However, the new body of literature aimed at the secular clergy introduced a more rigorous and detailed approach to maintaining purity. Monastic writers like Aldhelm, an Old English author from the 7th century, emphasized that true chastity was a matter of the soul rather than the body. For Aldhelm, the purity of the mind was more crucial than the physical state of virginity. He argued that true virginity is maintained by a free and pure mind, not by the absence of sexual activity alone. This idea persisted into the central Middle Ages, with monks like Guibert de Nogent writing about virginity as a spiritual journey rather than a mere physical condition. Despite this spiritual focus, the Church did not discount the importance of physical chastity. Saints' biographies often describe their subjects engaging in extreme practices to control their sexual desires, such as sitting in freezing water or fasting. These practices were seen as necessary to maintain both physical and spiritual purity. For example, the story of Saint Benedict rolling in a briar patch to suppress his lust became a popular example of the lengths to which saints would go to preserve their chastity. The secular clergy who lived among the laity faced constant temptation. Their image among the people was often one of womanizing, and this perception fueled the Church's efforts to enforce stricter rules on clerical chastity. From the 11th century onward, the Church began to emphasize the importance of ritual purity and physical virginity for the clergy. This emphasis was not just about moral virtue. It was also about maintaining a clear distinction between the clergy and the laity, which was crucial for the Church's authority and privileges. One of the most vocal critics of clerical marriage was Peter Damian, who, in a letter to Bishop Cunebertus of Turin in 1064, harshly condemned the wives of priests. He described them using vivid and derogatory terms, equating them with charmers of clerics and expulsion from paradise. Damian's rhetoric was extreme, but it reflected the Church's growing concern about the sexual activities of the clergy. The Church saw sexual activity as a form of ritual impurity that could taint the sacred duties of the clergy, particularly the celebration of the Eucharist. The Church also identified other activities that could put the clergy in a state of ritual impurity, such as shedding blood or touching a corpse. However, the most intense criticism was reserved for sexual activity. The ban on clerical marriage, which became official at the First Lateran Council in 1123, and was further reinforced at the Second Lateran Council in 1139, was a key part of the Church's reform movement. The Church declared that any marriage involving a priest or higher clergy was invalid, effectively making the wives of such men concubines. Despite these efforts, the Church's strictures on clerical marriage were not always effective. By the later Middle Ages, it was common for clergy to have long-term relationships with women, often living with them as concubines. For example, a priest named Richard Lucas in late 15th century, Paris lived with his concubine Antoinette for 18 years without much interference from his neighbors or the local court. It was only when he was discovered in a compromising situation with another woman that he faced prosecution. The Church's insistence on clerical celibacy was not without its critics. Some church leaders in the 15th century argued that the requirement was impractical and led to hypocrisy. They pointed out that the existence of clergy who were technically celibate but not chaste created various problems, including sexual relationships with parishioners and the potential for abuse of power during confession. Reformation leaders like Martin Luther echoed these criticisms, arguing that very few people were truly called to a life of chastity, and that the celibacy requirement made the majority of clergy into hypocrites and fornicators. In the Byzantine Empire, the approach to sexuality was different. Clerics were allowed to marry, and sexual activity was not as central to their identity as it was in the Western Church. The Byzantine Church did not obsess over sexual purity to the same extent, and this had broader implications for attitudes toward women and gender relations in Byzantine society. In the West, the distinction between clergy and laity was fundamentally understood in terms of sexuality. The medieval classification of society into those who pray, those who fight, and those who work highlighted the unique role of the clergy, who were expected to remain chaste. This classification reinforced the idea that chastity was a defining aspect of a cleric's identity. For lay people, choosing a life of chastity could be dangerous. In the 12th century, some heretical groups argued that all sexual activity was evil, leading to extreme views on both ends. Some groups rejected all sexual activity, while others saw no distinction between marital and non-marital sex. The Church often accused these groups of engaging in sexual deviance, though the evidence for these accusations is largely from hostile sources. The Church hierarchy was determined to control any lay person who chose a life of chastity. From the 13th century onward, the Church required formal vows and entry into a religious order for those who made a permanent decision not to marry. This became especially popular among women in late medieval Italy, leading to the establishment of third orders like the Franciscan and Dominican tertiaries. These women were part of a recognized group that the Church sanctioned to remain chaste, providing them with a structured and accepted path outside of marriage. The Church's focus on chastity and ritual purity was a complex and multifaceted issue, reflecting broader concerns about the separation of the clergy from the laity and the maintenance of the Church's authority and sanctity. Despite the challenges and criticisms, the idea of clerical celibacy remained a central aspect of Western Christian identity for centuries. Catherine of Siena, a famous Dominican tertiary and one of the few women named a doctor of the Church, exemplifies the powerful role that chastity played in the lives of medieval holy women. From a young age, Catherine knew she would never marry and had a deep aversion to sexual intercourse. Her parents resisted her desires, but she eventually convinced them of her commitment to a life of chastity. Her story is similar to modern accounts of people who recognize their sexual orientation early in life. Not all women with a calling to chastity managed to avoid marriage. Angela of Foligno, another Italian holy woman, prayed for the death of her family members to free herself from worldly ties. She sought to remove all distractions from her spiritual life, including the responsibilities of caring for a family. Her prayers were answered, and she became a devoted ascetic. Angela's story highlights how social norms often forced people with a calling to celibacy into marriage, but she found a way to follow her spiritual path. Men also faced pressure from their families to abandon their religious vocations. Thomas Aquinas, a renowned theologian, faced intense family opposition when he joined the Dominican order. His family even imprisoned him and brought a woman to seduce him, but Thomas resisted with a burning stick and prayed for a belt of chastity. According to his biographers, he remained chaste until his death, and his steadfastness was seen as a great virtue. Some couples managed to live chaste lives, even within marriage. The Church taught that spouses were obligated to provide each other with sexual intercourse, but there were ways to maintain chastity. Some medieval writers argued that having sex to fulfill this duty did not compromise one's chastity. However, persuading one's spouse to embrace chastity was considered a higher form of virtue. In some cases, couples remained chaste throughout their marriage, while others chose chastity after having enough children to ensure the continuation of their lineage. Despite the Church's high regard for chastity, it did not actively encourage chaste marriages. This was partly because chaste marriage blurred the lines between clergy and laity, and it was often the woman who sought chastity, which could be seen as a rebellion against her husband. Chastity in marriage was acceptable if both partners agreed, but it was not a common practice. For women, chastity might have been a way to avoid the risks of childbirth and the long-term commitment of raising children. However, the sources we have about chaste marriages, such as the lives of saints, come from the upper classes and were written by churchmen who emphasized the spiritual aspects rather than the practical benefits. Medieval medical theories also addressed the physical effects of sexual abstinence. Men were thought to need regular ejaculation to maintain the balance of humors in their bodies, and overindulgence was seen as harmful. Women, considered cooler and more prone to bodily pollutants, were thought to benefit from regular sexual activity to prevent health issues. Some medical texts even suggested that midwives could help relieve the pain caused by sexual abstinence in widows and virgins. Medical and moral views on chastity were not always aligned. While moralists emphasized the spiritual value of chastity, medical writers focused on the physical health implications. This tension is evident in the story of Elzevir of Sabran and his wife Delphine, who had been married for years without children. They had made a secret vow of chastity, and the physician Arnau of Villanova, while spiritually supportive, had to navigate the social and medical implications of their decision. Medieval writers recognized that individuals had varying levels of sex drive, and this could cause problems in marriage if one partner's desire was much stronger than the other's. Infertility was a significant concern, and impotence was one possible cause. Despite the emphasis on women's passivity in sex, they were often blamed for infertility. The question of rape and chastity was complex. Some medieval writers suggested that a woman who was raped was no longer chaste because she had allowed it to happen. However, a few texts argued that a woman could remain chaste if she did not consent. Medical theory added another layer to this debate. The two-seed theory held that both partners needed to experience pleasure for conception to occur, which could be used to argue that a woman who conceived during rape must have consented. However, some medical writers argued that a woman could experience physical pleasure without mental consent, suggesting that chastity of the soul could remain intact. Temptation was a constant challenge for those committed to chastity. The Desert Fathers, early Christian ascetics, emphasized that no one was immune to temptation. Aelred of Revalx, a Cistercian monk, advised his sister to be vigilant against temptation in all aspects of life, from food and drink to speech and sleep. He believed that constant vigilance and divine grace were essential to maintaining chastity. In this way, chastity was not just a physical state, but a deeply personal and spiritual identity. Whether one was naturally inclined to chastity or had to fight constant temptation, the commitment to a chaste life was a defining aspect of one's personhood in medieval society. In the 13th century, a book called the Ancrene Wisse was written to guide anchoress's women who lived as religious recluses in England. The book warned that even the slightest interaction with men could be dangerous for women. It suggested that a simple glance could lead to temptation, much like how Eve's curiosity about the apple led to humanity's fall from grace. The author emphasized that even a light look could have profound consequences, drawing a direct line from Eve's glance to the apple, and from there to the fall of humanity into sin and suffering. However, not all stories painted such a grim picture. The tale of Christina of Markyate, for instance, showed that God could protect the virtuous from temptation. Other writings cautioned that mere physical virginity was not enough. A person's soul had to be pure as well. Being a virgin in body was important, but being humble and devoted to God was even more crucial. This spiritual focus meant that people who had once been married or had engaged in sexual activity could still achieve a state of chastity through prayer and penance. By the late Middle Ages, the emphasis on physical virginity had shifted. While it was still important, chastity was increasingly seen as a spiritual and psychological state. Women who were not physically virgins could still be considered chaste if they lived a holy life. This idea of chastity as a spiritual condition rather than a physical one allowed more people to aspire to it, including married women and widows. They could strive to be honorary virgins by living a life of devotion and holiness. For example, St. Brigida of Sweden and Marjorie Kemp, a visionary and mystic, often sought assurance that they could be saved despite their past sexual experiences. Christ reassured Marjorie that because she was a maiden in her soul, she would be welcomed into heaven alongside other holy women. This idea of being a maiden in your soul highlighted the importance of personal identity and spiritual devotion over physical purity. For men, the line between chastity and virginity was less rigid. Chastity was seen as a constant struggle against temptation, while virginity was a state of having overcome lust, often with divine help. Men who managed to resist temptation were seen as champions of faith, much like Saint Benedict and Saint Anthony. Medieval society's understanding of sexual activity was different from ours. For example, women who lived together in households and did not engage in penetrative sex were still considered chaste. This was partly because medieval society did not always recognize same-sex desire as sexual. However, for men, same-sex activities were more likely to be seen as sexual, and thus more problematic. Despite these differences, medieval chastity was not about repressing desire. Instead, it was about redirecting desire towards spiritual matters. This erotic chastity did not mean a lack of desire, but a deliberate orientation of desire toward the divine. For example, Gilbert of Sempringham, the founder of the Gilbertine order, had a dream where he put his hand into a young woman's bosom. He initially feared it was a sign of impending sin, but later realized it was a divine message about divine peace. Medieval people often used erotic language to describe their relationship with God. Christina of Marquiate, after a period of intense desire for a cleric, had a vision of Christ as a child. This vision cured her of her earthly lust and filled her with divine love. Similarly, Aelred of Rivalx wrote to his sister, an anchoress, describing how God's love inflamed her with unspeakable longing. Nuns and recluses often used passionate language to express their devotion to God, seeing no conflict between the erotic and the divine. This blend of the erotic and the spiritual was not unique to women. Men, too, used such language. Alcuin, a priest, wrote to Charlemagne in terms that might seem romantic today, but in medieval times, this was a conventional way to express deep friendship and respect. Medieval people, both men and women, meditated on images of Christ, imagining him kissing them or lying in their bed. These visions were understood as spiritual and metaphorical, expressing a deep, intimate connection with the divine. In the legend of Saint Elizabeth of Thuringia, she allowed Christ, disguised as a leper, to sleep in her bed. This act, which shocked her husband, symbolized her devotion to caring for the poor and sick. It also hinted at the idea that a chaste life could be deeply intimate, even if not in a physical sense. Chaste marriage, where couples chose to live together without sexual relations, was another way to achieve spiritual intimacy. This decision was often made on the wedding night, symbolizing a new kind of conjugal relationship based on spiritual rather than physical love. In this way, medieval people saw chastity as a profound personal identity, a way of living that was both deeply erotic and deeply spiritual. Understanding the medieval concept of the erotic is a complex task, especially when we try to apply modern perspectives to it. Medieval people often saw the spiritual and the erotic as intertwined, sometimes in ways that might surprise us today. One key figure who explored this was Jean Gerson, a theologian in the early 15th century. Gerson wrote about the challenges of distinguishing between divine and devilish visions, particularly in the context of women's religious experiences. He shared a personal anecdote where a man, initially pious and wise, developed a deep and eventually carnal affection for a religious woman. This story illustrates how even the most devout could struggle to separate spiritual and physical love. Bernard of Clairvaux, another influential medieval figure, wrote extensively on the Song of Songs, using erotic language to describe his spiritual connection with Christ. For Bernard, kissing Christ on the mouth was a deeply spiritual act, a mystery of supreme generosity and ineffable sweetness. He recognized the potential for such language to be misunderstood, but he emphasized the sublime nature of his vision, which he believed was far removed from carnal desires. Medieval art provides another layer of complexity. For example, the wound in Christ's side, often depicted in art, can be seen as a symbol of both spiritual and physical intimacy. Modern observers might see this wound as resembling a vulva, but medieval people might have seen it differently. Caroline Bynum argues that the wound is more like a breast, symbolizing nourishment and motherhood. Jeffrey Hamburger suggests that nuns and pious women view the wound as an invitation to introspection, a way to connect with Christ's heart. Images of the torture of virgin martyrs, such as Saint Agatha, also raise questions. These depictions can be seen as both a path to transcendence and a reflection of misogyny. Robert Mills points out that what we now call pornography is a post-medieval concept, but there are structural similarities between medieval hagiography and modern pornography. Both aim to inspire action, whether spiritual or physical. The image of Mary Magdalene or the Virgin Mary exposing her breast, while meant to inspire devotion, could also be seen in a sexual light. Medieval people were not supposed to view these images with sexual intent, but it's possible that some, especially young men, might have. The religious purpose of these images was to emphasize the spiritual nourishment and motherhood of Mary, not to incite carnal desires. Chastity was a central ideal in medieval Christianity, representing self-control and a focus on spiritual matters. However, it also led to the rejection of anyone who might be seen as a temptation, and it placed unfair blame on those who failed to maintain their vows. This ideal defined many people's lives, creating a sexual orientation that was both beautiful and ugly, fundamentally different from modern Western views. While this chapter has focused primarily on Christianity, it's important to note that similar themes of chastity and sexual control were present in Judaism and Islam. In these religions, sexual activity was often seen as a distraction or polluting, and certain bodily functions required cleansing before prayer. However, the specific practices and meanings varied, reflecting the diverse cultural and religious contexts of the medieval period. In conclusion, the medieval understanding of the erotic was deeply intertwined with the spiritual. While modern interpretations can provide valuable insights, they must be approached with caution. Medieval people brought their own meanings to these texts and images, meanings that were shaped by their unique cultural and religious contexts. By recognizing these complexities, we can gain a deeper appreciation for the rich and multifaceted nature of medieval thought.